Alright, so I finally played through the most valuable game in my collection, my physical collection, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. And the question is, was it worth the price? The price I paid, I'd say so. I was lucky enough to get it before Three Houses came up when it spiked up again. Although not lucky enough, I actually have a former coworker who was lucky enough to get it before Awakening when it was possible to get it for sub $20. Allegedly. To be fair, I didn't see the proof or anything, but in between Awakening and Three Houses, it was still possible to get it for under 3 digits, which I particularly paid 80. Goes for a bit more than that last time I checked, although still cheaper than getting a Switch 2 and renting it from Nintendo's shitty service. But yeah, overall it was a solid, Fire Emblem game, nothing too crazy, except I think it was around chapter 22-ish. There was, a few maps in a row around it that were particularly creative and interesting with some of the gameplay gimmicks that they were trying. And they all worked pretty well. One thing that I wasn't used to is that I feel like, because I've mostly played games, Awakening onward, I feel like ballistas or really long-reaching tomes were more of a gimmick in those games. For, a map or two, only a unit or two in those maps. But here, it's more of a feature around that chapter 22-ish point that is just, a constant thing in the maps from pretty much that point onward. So that obviously sort of adjusts your strategy a bit more than usual. Going in, I actually heard this was one of the easier Fire Emblem games. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I feel like early mid-ish game and even some of the, last map or two were pretty challenging for the way that I play. Granted, I play, everyone lives, so maybe if, it was a little differently and I was willing to sacrifice a unit or two, it would have been a bit easier. I will say, actually from after the map I'm on now till, that last map or two were probably a little easier than I was expecting based on, what I had experienced to that point, sort of after you promote your units and that. Certainly, not a cakewalk if you were maybe expecting a bit more of that, at least not at certain points. It does have me a little worried because, I heard the game after, the next one I hope to dive into, Radiant Dawn, is one of the hardest games in the series. So, has me a little worried given, the reputation of these two games. But, we'll see. Still looking forward to it when I get around to it. The only other pre-Awakening game I played was Sacred Stones. And I didn't really get as into that one. I feel like part of that was the whole support system in these earlier games is a lot harder to follow than it is currently. I feel like, the bit of a break it gives you in between maps and the incentive to sort of adjust your strategy to have certain units next to each other is really important. Luckily, this time I did, get a second screen on my side to sort of keep track of who had supports. But even then, I remember an instance with Rolf in particularly, ironically, because we see him getting promoted in the background here, where he had 2 conversations open, and I thought I fucked something up or was misremembering because it would only let me have one of those conversations. I even, tried reloading my save, so I'm not sure the exact way it works here. It's still different, but at least, having that second screen by my side sort of helped a bit with it. I do wonder, because I didn't even get, a max support with anyone. I wonder if I was supposed to more make a decision on whether to have, various lower supports or one higher support. But even if you missed the supports entirely, because, you didn't want the second screen or whatever your reason is, there's actually, in between missions, just general base conversations that you can have that are tied to the story that sort of scratch some of that itch. And I definitely really liked that. A first in all of the games I've played through the series happened here. I missed a recruitable unit. Other than, I remember in Echoes, you had to pick between Dean and Sonya. I'm not talking those situations. Particularly, I missed Stefan. His recruitment's pretty weird. I guess you have to be in a specific area of a specific map for him to even show up. And normally I sort of keep track of things, like I'll pull up, who to expect to pop up to sort of look out for, and I just overlooked him or thought he was on a different map, and by the time I realized, oh shit, it was already too late. I was already, save well overridden on, another map, undoing, hours of progress, and it just wasn't worth it, unfortunately, especially too since he was another sword fighter and Mia was performing pretty well throughout the entire game, honestly. Even, when sort of comparing her to other, recruitments. Like I remember getting Lucia later on. And I think Zeark was another one. So I don't even think he would have wound up being my top choice or even my backup choice. I will say the story itself felt a bit different in this game. Like, I like the comparison I saw to some conversation around Tokyo Ghoul versus Tokyo Ghoul Re, where you have one that's a little more character centric and you have another that's more plotline centric. And I feel like in general Fire Emblem, all the games I played to this point have been more character centric. And you have a decent story, but it's nothing too crazy. But this time around, and I'm not saying there aren't, good in-depth characters here, but I feel like the story revolved around the plot line more so than usual here. And I really liked it when, thinking of the story itself, it might be my favorite in the series so far. I also like how they tackled, serious issues that you normally see in more mature games, like the relationship between the Barrock, which are this universe's humans, and Legos, or however you pronounce it, that are this universe's shapeshifters. There's, a complicated history with, slavery and racism, and it's handled very well. Not, really preachy or anything, and it's just interesting to see, why all these characters feel the way that they do, and to, see that sort of develop through the story and the events occurring. Granted, I did hear that this isn't the darkest, most mature game in the series. I heard Genealogy of the Holy War is, considered to be that, which is, why some people say that might be part of the reason why they've, been maybe, hesitant or taken forever with that remake that we've all been wanting to see. The only thing I didn't like with it, and this is a very mild spoiler for, the middle of the game, is I feel the character that they really were trying to, drive home the, complicated relationship between the two with was Rayson. Like, they gave, strong reasons as to why he would hate Barrocks, and you saw, him being given even more reasons to throughout the story, and then he eventually gets saved by Barrock, and I felt like, and maybe it was the intention here, but I feel like he came around, a bit quicker or less hesitant. Granted, I didn't unlock a lot of his support conversations, But for the general story, his whole complications there were sort of just dropped, I felt like, a lot more or a lot quicker than I would have expected, especially with, like I said, he was a character who I felt like they really were trying to, push, the complicated relationship between, the two different groups there. But like I said, maybe that was the intent there. But, he went from, being out for blood, it seemed like, to, just being more cordial than I would have expected. Something I really like, though, is I feel like with the series in general, with their protagonist and other, important characters, I feel like a lot of times they're some of my least favorite in the series, especially compared to some of the more interesting supporting cast. They kind of just come off, a little boring in my opinion. But Ike is probably my favorite protagonist in the series. He definitely, doesn't fit that more boring traditional series protagonist route. He's, more interesting and a little more stubborn in his ways, and I really enjoyed that. And even Alencia, another major character, where maybe not as interesting, I feel like she still came off, just a bit more likable with, what she went through and just watching her grow throughout the series to go from princess to queen, And yeah, overall, I really enjoyed the game. I was a little worried going in, considering, I didn't really like Sacred Stones, and, even I was wondering if I was going to get my money's worth. I think I've said in the past, I feel like new Pokemon Snap sort of set a new precedent for me. I know some people, and I for a while did the dollar per hour of entertainment, but I enjoyed new Pokemon Snap so much that I was willing to adjust that to $2 per hour of entertainment, and I got over 40 hours here. It was $80 for me, so well worth it. And looking forward to seeing how they continue everything, It's not super common for the series to have a more direct sequel. So, not, like I said, going to take a little break. And even when I do get around to it, if I hopefully don't get, too distracted in between, as I always say. Yeah, because I feel like I have too many games at this point that I said I'm going to get to soon in, previous videos and that, and here's just another one. But even when I get to it, like, I don't know how it's, structured. I saw something about it maybe having, 4 different parts with different, protagonists and groups. So I don't even know when I get there if, maybe it's worth, taking a break in between, the different major parts there, split it into half or fourths or whatever. We'll see when we get there. And, hopefully it's not too difficult. I know part of that, too, is because, they listed it as easy, normal, hard when they really intended for easy to be the normal mode. So people were, going in unintentionally a little over their heads. I would have been playing on easy mode regardless. And like I said, I know, play styles can have, a deal to do with, how difficult one of these games could be. So who knows how my experience will wind up being.